Уважаемая Хельга, уважаемые участники конференции,
Dear Helga, dear conference participants, it is very important that our conference is taking place in a period of heightened confrontation between two blocs of leading countries in the world. This is the NATO countries, led by the USA, and the other bloc, which is taking shape before our very eyes, is Russia and China, whose joint declaration of February 4th of this year proclaimed their intention to be together on all issues. This is extremely important because mankind is on the brink of World War III, and the knife's edge of that confrontation is my country, Ukraine. Essentially, this is what we warned about. Let me remind you about my intervention at the European Parliament on February 26, 2014. That was during the tour by representatives of our party, which I believe was very important for the international community, when we visited Germany, France, and Italy. Our friends from the Schiller Institute helped us organize that trip. And at that time, I said at my press conference that the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 had brought to power Nazis and Russophobes, and that this would give rise to extremely grave problems, not only for Ukraine and not only for the Eurasian continent, but also for the entire world. And indeed, from 2014 on, the USA started strongly sponsoring Ukraine and preparing a confrontation with Russia. What other interpretation can there be of the fact that since then, $2.7 billion of lethal weaponry has been allocated? What other interpretation can there be of orienting the government of Ukraine not towards a peaceful solution of the crisis and towards finding ways through diplomacy to resolve this bloody conflict in southeastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, but rather constantly instigating them towards war with Russia? We have witnessed a special kind of militaristic psychosis over the past 2 or 3 months since last fall. As I understand it, the United States gave the go-ahead to all of their satellites so that not only they themselves started pouring an absolute avalanche of weapons into Ukraine, but also the Baltic countries did, and Poland, and Canada, and the UK. All of them suddenly disturbed about what was happening in Ukraine, and supposedly for the purpose of defending the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine against Russia, started to ship to Ukraine more and more and more weapons. And I emphasize, these are not gifts to our country. This involves loans. The latest loan came from the United States with credit guarantees of $1 billion. Great Britain allocated $2.5 billion, or 2 3/10 to be precise. More than $500 million from Canada, 1.2 billion euros from France. And how are these supposedly going to be repaid? What are they to be repaid from? This is a yoke, it's shackles on our people. But that's not even the main thing. The most important is that while the Ukrainian economy is destroyed, our people serve simply as cannon fodder. And the Western mass media constantly hammer away. When the war with Russia begins, the Ukrainian side will suffer losses of 50,000 or 85,000 people. And what is this? This is such heavy pressure on our country, on our people. and such an extremely hard psychological attack on the state of mind of our public that it's absolutely unbearable. It is simply unbearable. So what is happening in our country with the population is a very difficult process. People are packing emergency go bags. They're trying to locate bomb shelters. They're organizing local area defense militias. And it's all without question a blow to the economy. And when a month ago President Zelensky saw all this, even he was dumbstruck because Ukraine has lost $14 billion just from the beginning of this year. $12.5 billion from capital flight and $1.5 billion spent by the Ukrainian central bank to support the currency. And let me stress, Ukraine's gold and currency reserves were less than 30 billion, and here you have 14 billion already in losses. There's a collapse of our euro bonds, of Ukrainian state debt. There's a collapse of the national currency, as I already mentioned, and a blockade on international capital. International capital markets are closed to Ukraine. An outflow of investment. And this all has happened literally in the past few weeks. The National Bank of Ukraine has already adjusted downward its GDP forecast for this year from 3.8% to 3.4% growth. What will happen next? People lack resources in our country, even for the basic necessities. Today it was announced that the price of bread will soon be raised by 20 or 30%. And that's when we already, because of brutal pension and wage policies, have the most impoverished population in Europe, with the shortest lifespan. This is what comes from the efforts to set our countries against each other. And that's when Russia has repeatedly said that they have no intention of invading Ukraine. They are doing their military exercises on their own territory. But the Western media, the United States, and Great Britain don't listen to that. Even when Russia reduces the number of its troops near the border, pulling them back to their bases as the exercises finish up, it continues. They say, no, we don't see any de-escalation process. No, we don't trust what Russia says. And what is the purpose? That a war take place without fail. Who is igniting the bonfire of war inside Ukraine and from the outside? Inside Ukraine, it's the Nazis first and foremost. All these organizations that have been reborn and burgeoned, parties, movements, organizations thirsting for blood, they have an ideology called Ukrainian integral nationalism. This ideology was created by Dontsov and Siborsky in the early 20th century, then implemented by Bandera and Shukhevich. This is an ideology of enmity between our peoples, an ideology of war, misanthropic war. This ideology of a Nazified Ukraine has infected a section of the population of our country. And worst of all, this ideology has become the official ideology of the Ukrainian government, just as we warned. And as a result, people with Russian culture, members of ethnic minorities, have become second-class people. Look at me. I am ethnically Ukrainian, but my native language is Russian. And I don't conceive of myself outside of Russian civilization. But all broadcasting by Russian TV channels and all broadcasting of programs in the Russian language has been banned in Ukraine. The courts, government agencies, schools, and universities work only in Ukrainian. And we have the constant fanning of the psychosis that the Muscovites, pejorative term, must be destroyed. This is said openly on television. That's inside Ukraine. And outside Ukraine, we see that the USA, headed by Biden, who is supposedly concerned about Ukraine's sovereignty,
Только нацистов и делают только то, что в их интересах. Почему Байден?
listens only to the Nazi ideologues' version, what's in their interests. Why does Biden, who talks about sovereignty, not understand that Ukraine's sovereignty was incorporated in the Declaration of State Sovereignty and that our sovereignty was upheld in two referendums in 1991? The referendums, one in March and one in December. And since that's the case, Western democracy should have supported democracy in Ukraine. But that means people's power and the will of the people. Read the Declaration of State Sovereignty. Look at what our population voted for. Remember that this was the kind of Ukraine that the international community supported. This was the kind of sovereignty that was recognized as the sovereignty of Ukraine. And it included non-bloc status, neutrality for Ukraine. And it included a union state with Russia and Belarus. If we had had a union state, there would have been no problem with Crimea. Crimea would have remained the favorite child of both Ukraine and Russia rather than being an object of contention. Therefore, today it's important to realize what must be done in order to change the situation radically and not allow a war. I'll divide this into two parts, what Ukraine must do and what the international community must do. The top priority for Ukraine is to carry out denazification. What's needed is to help the Ukrainian government with united efforts by the entire world community to ban all parties, movements, and organizations with a Nazi orientation. There are sufficient international norms and principles for doing this. I'll just name the conventions which authorize the international community to help Ukraine in this respect. They are the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's all spelled out there. A ban on war propaganda, a ban on the functioning of organizations that take a position of racial discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, or any other criteria. That's what needs to be done in Ukraine. And it's of outstanding importance for Ukraine. And it has to be understood that without the following, Ukraine will not survive. After denazification, the restoration of our non-bloc status and allowing us to implement what was the expressed will of our people, a union state with Russia and Belarus. As for the international side, what needs to be done? Of course, we passionately hope and pray that Russia and China together will be able to convince the USA and Germany to sit down at the negotiating table and work out a new world architecture to find those principles and validate them and put them at the basis of some documents which provide a possibility for peaceful coexistence of different countries with respect for their national interests and distinctive characters. And of course, we need to change the world economic model. We remember how Lyndon LaRouche explained to us that without a radical change in the economic model, there will be no sustained development, and it will be impossible to defend the national interests of different countries. This is what all progressive humanity should strive for, and that is the position of our Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine. Thank you very much for listening.